Hello everyone. This lecture is going to be about assessments and how we as educators assess people and evaluate people. We're going to go into a little bit of some high stakes testing, the stress it puts on students, and also we're going to look at just a little bit at the South Korean model and extreme high stakes testing. High stakes testing is one of the most significant factors in classroom instruction today. Increasingly, teachers and schools are being asked to provide specific indicators of individual student learning, as well as detailed peer comparisons. Test grades, assessment, and evaluation have become integral parts of the process of schooling. Teachers systematically collect data throughout the year from each student. Teachers are expected to provide reasonable and clear answers to basic parent questions such as, what did my child not learn in the class? Or what did my child learn in social studies in any class? One of the key terms we have is the term evaluation. Evaluation can be seen as a way of making a decision about the value of something based on some systematically organized data. So if I ask you to evaluate how someone worked on your car and you took your car in to get an oil change, and I would say, well, can you evaluate how that person has done a good job? We're seeing more of this in the business world. Pretty much every time you go anywhere now, they're asking you to do a customer survey. And that customer survey is part of a multi-level assessment system to evaluate the quality of that person's franchise. You'll see Walmart receipts, Hardee's receipts, or pretty much all the receipts now have some kind of survey that they want you to do. This is not really how the school or how anybody is evaluated. It's just a part of an evaluation system. I've never seen it more than whenever you buy a car. When you buy a car, especially if you buy a new car, but if you buy it from a major dealership, you'll receive a survey in the mail, and those surveys are critical for the success and pretty much if they're going to keep the salesman on that job, because that's a major survey, and they use that as an assessment system, and that's an evaluation. So evaluation, literally to the term, means to determine or judge the value or worth of something or someone. When you go buy something, you evaluate it before you make a determination on how much you're going to pay for it. Evaluation has many objectives and subjective dimensions. It involves much more than giving tests and labeling students. In recognition of the complexity of student assessment in any of the fields, for example, many of the organizations have stated to gauge effectively the efforts of students and teachers in any of the programs, evaluators must augment traditional tests with performance evaluations, portfolios, and multiple layers. So when you have an evaluation, you definitely need to have multiple levels. This video I'm going to put in right here is kind of a good little video that it's just a funny commercial. Whenever someone plays basketball, especially high school basketball, and they go to college basketball, that transition can take place over a couple of months or even a year. The coach sees you, but whenever you're going from the college to the NBA or to a professional organization, that's a major commitment, and that's why whenever the draft comes up, people start getting who's going to go where, because pretty much when a team drafts you in the first round, that's 20 picks, 25 picks they're going to have. A first round draft is a major player in that organization. So if you get a first round draft, you're going to get a lot of money. And because of that, many NBA teams, all NBA teams, have what are called scouts. And scouts evaluate players. And when they evaluate them, they determine if they're good or how good they're going to be. And they kind of project how good they're going to be, and that's how it works. Sometimes the evaluations are wrong. And when an evaluation is wrong, that actually can cost the team titles and players, and it can destroy a basketball team if they have a large number of poor evaluations. So that's why scouts are critical, and having scouts that know what they're doing is also critical. And this commercial I'm about to show you is a basketball player named Stephen Curry. Stephen Curry is currently one of the best players in the NBA, and Stephen Curry is doing this commercial, and he's reading an evaluation that someone had done on him as an NBA scout. And of course the evaluation was negative, and everything it says about him is wrong, because Steph Curry is currently the best basketball player on the planet. You can compare him with LeBron, but Steph Curry is unbelievable. So let's go ahead and watch that video and look how evaluations can sometimes be wrong.
Steph Curry with the shot. 0 to 100.
Stephen Curry, 6'3", 185 pounds, position, point guard. Stephen's explosiveness and athleticism are below standard. He's not a great finisher around the basket. He needs to considerably improve as a ball handler. Often struggles against physical defenders. Stephen must develop as a point guard in order to make it in the league. He will have limited success at the next level. Do not rely on him to run your team.
My actions being louder than my words. 0 to 100. Know yourself, know your worth. 0 to 100.
So obviously, after watching that video, you see that that evaluation was incorrect. And I would actually pretty much say I'm pretty confident that that scout was probably fired. Grades are one of the shorthand ways of communicating the results of an evaluation. So for example, if I say Hank got an A on his math test, that means that the teacher evaluated his performance and decided it was exceptional. In the absence of a grade, a sentence, symbol, or other means could have served the same purpose. Grades, however, are often used because they are easy to record, communicate to others, and compare. So that's one of our first terms besides the term evaluation. So we have the term grades. In contrast to grades, let's look at the key word assessments. Assessments are those systematic ways we use to collect our data. They encompass measures such as simple charts for keeping track of the number of times the students ask questions in a social studies or any class. And they comprehend collections of students' work. So, grades are how we symbolize you did a good job and we communicate. An assessment is our assessment system. It's the way we track someone. One key term that we see is authentic assessment. And this goes beyond a lot of book chapters and actually goes into some of the newer research. So I have a small video right now on authentic assessment, just so I can introduce you to that term.
School of the Future is a 6 through 12 public school in District 2 in New York City. It's located on the corner of 22nd Street and Lexington Avenue in Manhattan.
I have to usually answer why it's called School of the Future after people think we beam people up to the Star Trek Enterprise. But what I say is that School of the Future, although originally was named for Macintosh computers, my partner and I feel School of the Future now is a spearhead of progressive education that is rigorous and accountable.
And we're continuing to be a progressive school, but also to figure out how we are folding in assessment and folding in accountability. I think what makes authentic assessment authentic is that it's actually the kind of work that a person in that discipline would do. A science authentic assessment would challenge the kids to do the same kind of tasks that a scientist would actually do.
But try to give work that either mirrors what they might be doing later in life or will prepare them for those kind of tasks or is simply meaningful to them.
In terms of authentic work within the school, it needs to be something that the student really cares about and that the teacher really cares about. So if we want a school where it's just really making real change and really addressing students in their hearts, then we can't have curriculum that is just going through the motions.
And then the other piece is that making sure that the task is a synthesis type of task. That will ensure the critical thinking necessary to feel that rigor is happening.
I think of authentic assessment as a window into the true understanding of the student.
It makes teaching much more efficient. You think that it takes all this time, but in fact it's far more targeted and efficient, and it really speeds things up.
I think first about what are the big ideas I want them to come away with. Some may argue that's curriculum, but I think it's even more fundamental than curriculum. What are the big things I want the students to be able to walk away with?
The key is asking yourself, how will I know? And ask that up front as you're doing backwards planning. What does that learning look like? What does it sound like? What would I be hearing? What would I be seeing on paper? And then based on that, creating whatever assessment tool works best for you.
When you're starting to plan your curriculum, start with, all right, so what are the 3 assessments then, the 3 big ones that I'm going to need to see whether or not they got these skills? And then you can start thinking of smaller assessments on the way there, little check-ins, and then designing the activities that go along with, does this activity that I normally do, does it address what I really want them to understand?
I've been teaching now for about 13 years, and a lot of educational fads have come and gone. But one that I believe is hopefully here with us to stay is precisely this question of how do we know they got it? Before, sometimes it felt like if we taught a great lesson and the students were nodding a lot and maybe writing in their notebooks, we felt good. But now we have to find out, did they actually understand the material we were teaching them? Are they connecting this to their own intellectual interest? Is it authentic for them? Was there real learning that happened there? And I think we're getting better at doing that as teachers. I think we're getting better at doing that.
At this time, whenever I'm lecturing about assessments, and you bring in that authentic assessment, you kind of start going into this progressive education movement and this idea of a better system. So I kind of, at this point, usually will stop, and I like to talk about a new movement that occurred in, it came in the 80s, I believe. Let me double check my notes. But it's actually 1989. It created what's called Teach for America. And I like to bring in this because many people have questions about Teach for America, and you're going to see a video in a minute about it. But what Teach for America does is it brings in some of the best, brightest minds in all kinds of fields and offers them a teaching license. So I just want to give you, just so you'll understand what's going on for Teach for America. But what happens is, in 1989, a young lady who was working at Princeton decided to she wrote this paper, her master's thesis, and she just made the argument that what if we took the Peace Corps, which was where people left in the 1960s, when people left college and they went and worked in Africa and then they came back. So it's kind of like a 2 to 3 year service to society. And she said, let's take the Peace Corps model and bring that to education. So her idea was, and it worked, was to take students who were in Ivy League colleges, and most of them just got their four-year degree, and then let them go into inner city areas and struggling schools, Mississippi Delta, low-performing schools, and let them teach for a year or two where they will get a master's degree, or they'll get college credit, or they'll student loan reimbursement, some kind of financial incentive as well. But they'll also be allowed to teach and experience that before they go back to college, usually to grad school, law school, or whatever they want to choose from. So it's kind of a way that instead of becoming a teacher for 30 years and then retiring, it was kind of a way where someone could kind of do a Peace Corps, where they would go into a school district, help them out for a brief period of time, and then leave. Many people disagree with this, but that was one element of it. It really shocked the system that we're going to embrace teaching for only 2 to 3 years and then walk away. And of course, she never made that statement that we're going to walk away, because many schools wouldn't want teachers who are going to walk away. But that's pretty much the idea of it. We're going to walk in, and then maybe we'll be lifelong educators. Maybe that will help. The reason I bring in Teach for America with this is when you start looking at new education systems that are based on assessments, a lot of these ideas are coming from the top scholars that Teach for America, but also this idea of testing is kind of ruining Teach for America and all these top levels. A lot of these Teach for America students, if you watch their videos and you watch their first year, they're excited, and then by the end of the first year, testing and the assessment systems that have been created in these schools ever since No Child Left Behind and Nation at Risk in the 80s, especially since Nation at Risk, it has created, they're just like, I cannot believe this assessment system is going on, this high-stakes testing. So PBS and TV shows have done a really good job on what's going on with Teach for America because their numbers have dropped. So let's just watch this small video on Teach for America and what's going on with it. But my argument has always been the assessment system in place post Nation at Risk has really affected the teacher quality even outside Teach for America, but for everyone, because everyone's like, this testing's getting out of hand. So just a quick video on Teach for America.
Next, the struggle to draw college graduates back to the classroom. Teach for America has sent more than 33,000 participants into schools in low-income, high-need communities since it launched in 1990. But as Brandis Friedman of public television station WTTW Chicago reports, the organization is now having a harder time recruiting new candidates.
Why do I do that?
Because it's a negative charge.
Because it's a negative charge.
Today's chemistry lesson is on ionic bonds.
What does oppositely charged atoms mean?
Teacher Jaquan Savage feels he's charged with making a difference in his students' lives. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill graduate recently finished a 2-year Teach for America fellowship in Memphis. He's now one of 950 Teach for America alumni working in Chicago public schools. This is Savage's first year as a full-fledged teacher at this charter school, Butler College Prep. For years, the program has been a top choice for top grads.
I do consider myself a success story because I had strong teachers, and it's very thought-provoking just to think of, had I not had those strong teachers, where my life would have ended up. And so I definitely want to be a catalyst for making sure that all leaders, no matter where they're from, no matter what their socioeconomic background is, any situation that they come from, that they have the opportunity to obtain a quality education as well.
What would be the subscript for aluminum now?
Savage and Teach for America fellows get 5 weeks of intensive summer training before taking over a classroom. But the once highly competitive program is noticing a troubling trend. Not enough recruits like Savage.
We are facing greater than normal challenges on the recruitment front, and here's what we're seeing. As of December, we had 20,000 applications for the incoming core. That's behind pace from last year. And if this pace continues, we would fall about 25% short of what our partners around the country, our school partners around the country, have said they need from us.
Teach for America's Chicago director Josh Anderson says a number of factors are contributing to a tougher recruiting environment on the elite college campuses where it finds many of its applicants. Among those factors, the concern that teaching is an underpaid profession.
In this post-recession moment, we're seeing, especially for top talent on college campuses, greater and greater competition for folks out there. And so people have many more competing offers that they're considering, very attractive competing offers that they're considering than they were just a couple years ago.
Anderson says he's concerned that a smaller pool of candidates will mean a weaker pool of potential teachers.
We substantially increase the odds of having great teachers, the most effective teachers in front of our students, the stronger, more robust, more diverse that pool of candidates is. And so that's why this trend, if we're not able to reverse it, if we're not able to combat it effectively, is concerning, because it means real things downstream for student achievement in the very near future.
Is this possible?
Teach for America argues the problem isn't just its own, but points to a national decline in graduates interested in becoming teachers. Experts say some of that is brought on by the highly politicized landscape of modern-day teaching. Robert Lee runs the Chicago Teacher Education Pipeline for Illinois State University, which produces most of Illinois' teaching graduates. Even he has noticed that teacher prep enrollment is down slightly.
It used to be a very reliable profession, one that was filled with joy, and there was a lot of joy in the teaching and learning process. And that somehow has been stripped away as well. There's a lot of testing going on right now, and high-stakes, standardized achievement tests that try to pit teacher performance, if you will, based on that one exam. And I think that's dangerous as well. I think it's a problem if we're trying to recruit our best and brightest people to enter the field.
But critics of the Teacher Corps say the organization has brought this problem of a shortage on itself. Eleni Katsaru directs elementary education at the University of Illinois at Chicago.
When your larger message is you only need 5 weeks to become a teacher, it demeans, it reduces, it oversimplifies what it is that teachers ought to be doing and what they do. And so in that way, I think, again, they've contributed to making it less than what it actually is.
Katsaru argues that sending so many untested and briefly trained teachers into the classroom to serve mostly low-income students is more than just unethical.
I don't think it's fair or ethical or professional to practice on kids. It just isn't. And so we have practice-based teaching in the programs that are solid and profound in the ways in which they let students understand community and understand classroom practices and so on. There's a reason why we have practice-based approaches in schools, because it takes time.
And how do we name NIONs?
But Teach for America says their teachers are making a difference, and that they're not only prepared after initial training, but they continue to receive mentoring and coaching throughout their fellowship.
The biggest reason that people sign up has, I think, little to do with the concrete things they get from the organization, but most to do with the opportunity to be in front of and work with our students and families and make a big impact, because teachers can make a profound impact in the lives of students. I think that is number one.
And for teacher Jaquan Savage,
go around, keep bonding, keep finding different people.
That impact is the bond he shares with his students. I'm Brandis Friedman reporting for the PBS NewsHour from Chicago.
I like that discussion because it shows you that a teacher's being trained in 5 weeks, and then they're being put in an assessment system that schools have that is extremely stressful and can really affect the students. She mentioned, the lady mentioned that we're kind of experimenting on students, which is a good point. That's when you're going to get a key term called lab schools that emerge. Some universities actually have what are called lab schools, which is a partnership school that they kind of experiment with, and it's really effective. I'll give you an example. With Mississippi, we have what are called charter schools. Mississippi started adopting those. So Mississippi State University, for example, would request a charter school and then place that school inside the university's grounds or near geographically. And then the university would staff that and kind of run that school, but parents who sent their child there to that charter school would have to sign waivers that allowed their child to be experimented on. Not physical experiments, but you would allow student teachers to come in and try different teaching methods. They could try different assessment systems. That's kind of like what a lab school is. It would still be monitored by IRB, the Institute Review Board, but it would also be allowed, there would be more freedom to do research inside those settings. When you have a lab school, it's highly effective. What happens then is you start pulling people to your campus who want to work in that field. It's very effective. So that would be something. That's what she's talking about when she says that we have experimenting, and there are field-based places like that. She's talking about lab schools. Let's continue on. You'll see right here it says standards. Standards are related to both assessment and evaluation. They are the criteria teachers use for making judgments. Standards determine what every student should know, how carefully something should be assessed, and what is satisfactory performance or an acceptable level of learning. So just to refresh or to reevaluate, we have grades, how we communicate something on one issue. Assessment, how we're going to use our grades and our assessment system. And standards are at what level should someone hit to master. Real easy, real simple. I also put here about the use and misuse of tests. Testing assumed a very large role in our society over the last 60 years. There was a report in the 1980s called A Nation at Risk. I have gone over that before. But A Nation at Risk really scared a lot of people. And there's actually a passage that says, we need to go to war about it. It really made it like we have to go to war with this. So it brought in this era of accountability and this era of testing, which was reinforced over many years by many presidents, with No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, Common Core, Parks testing. Testing has really been overdone, and everyone agrees to that there is way too much testing. For example, the testing with No Child Left Behind almost tripled. No Child Left Behind increased testing from 6 to 18 per year, or 17 per year, almost tripled, 17. So that definitely shows you that. A student from 1st grade to 12th grade will have taken 113 standardized tests, which is insane, but that's actually what's occurred. That would be any kind of standardized test they've taken, including practice tests. Although tests can aid the teacher in some aspect of evaluation, they're often inappropriate measures of what a student has learned. Tests, especially paper and pencil tests, sometimes are used on occasions where other tools would be more efficient or suitable. It seems obvious, for example, that it would be inappropriate to use a paper and pencil test dealing with the art to discover where the students were exceptional artists. Rather, we likely would have a qualified artist or a panel judge their artwork. Also, for example, when you turn 16 years of age, you do take a paper and pencil test to drive, but that test really doesn't have a lot of weight. It's the driving test that's more important. And also, obviously, after the driving test, years of safe driving that they don't have to suspend your license. Critics of existing testing practices also point to the potential negative consequences, and it causes high stress, tests do. And tests can also create people to do things that maybe sometimes they shouldn't do. Under No Child Left Behind, schools that did very well and did a good job received federal funding whenever they did better. And whenever they did worse, they lost federal funding. So that was kind of like the perfect storm. You had money tied in to test results. And what happened was the greatest testing scandal in the history of the American education system. And that, of course, is the Atlanta, Georgia testing cheating scandal, or the Atlanta cheating scandal, which you can Google and pull up a Wikipedia page on it. If you go to Wikipedia, it really doesn't share enough for you. It doesn't do justice to the enormity of this cheating scandal. What happened was, predominantly African American school district, the Atlanta, ended up just pretty much everyone got arrested. And it was just not a good situation. It became an institutionalized cheating scandal where administrators actually cheated. I'm going to show you a video on it. But the Atlanta cheating scandal actually occurred and was identified by a local, I think it was the Atlanta Chronicle, but I may be wrong with that one. But what they found out was they started doing statistical analysis, and they started discovering that schools that had really high test scores, for example, you'd have a middle school that had a very high test score in Atlanta. Well, when the students went to the high school, they had a very low test score. So they said, well, there's something wrong with that. Those students should be bringing those test scores. So that's one of the big red flags. When when you have a student who's in a middle school and they go to a high school and that entire group scores low, that's a red flag, meaning that something may have been going on at the middle school. So at that point, what Atlanta did was the paper started publishing these results saying that something's wrong with statistics. Students are scoring high in some areas and scoring low, and there's something not right here. So what happened was the state of Georgia, I apologize, actually sent in investigators because when we're dealing with federal money, it's a crime to change test scores when dealing with federal money. It's called fraud. So teachers were brought in to their schools, and there was a Atlanta Bureau of Investigation officer or a Georgia Bureau of Investigation officer, and he would take his jacket off, and he would have a gun, and he'd have a badge. And he'd say, you know, we also have a federal agent here, and if you lie to us, then that's against the law. So let's ask you some questions. Is cheating going on? And teachers at that point started breaking down and telling about these huge cheating scandals that were occurring in Atlanta, all because of the high-stakes testing. After many years, the end result was a lot of people lost their teaching license, and ultimately a lot of administrators pled guilty to crimes and went to jail. The superintendent of Atlanta, she passed away of breast cancer, I believe, before the trial. So it was just not a good situation. And everyone kind of had to pull themselves back and say, these are educators. What happened? What made them do that? And the answer was high-stakes testing. Let's watch a video real quick on the Atlanta cheating scandal.
Good evening. There's no harder lesson than the one taught today to 8 Atlanta educators by an angry judge after they were convicted on charges typically reserved for mobsters. He threw the book at them, teachers, principals among them, handing down lengthy prison sentences for their roles in a massive cheating scandal in which standardized test scores at underperforming schools were inflated. The judge told them the conspiracy harmed thousands of children. Our chief education correspondent, Rahema Ellis, shows us how it all played out.
This thing was pervasive. It's like the sickest thing that's ever happened to this town.
In a tense courtroom, Judge Jerry Baxter imposed harsh sentences on 8 former Atlanta public school educators convicted of racketeering, conspiring to fix standardized test scores to improve results.
There were thousands of children that were harmed in this thing. This is not a victimless crime.
3 disgraced educators, former teachers and administrators, were sentenced to 20 years, serving 7 in prison, the rest on probation. The others, including a principal and elementary school teachers, were sentenced to 5 years, serving 1 to 2 of them behind bars. Emotions ran high.
How can you say that?
As the sentences came down.
You sit down, I'm going to put you in jail. If you yell at me, point at me.
It was painful for everyone, including the judge.
I consider you a wonderful educator, and that's what makes it so sad. You were under so much pressure.
Yesterday, the judge heard from dozens of character witnesses pleading for leniency.
Have mercy on my daughter, please. I'm giving you some opportunity.
And so Judge Baxter asked both sides to agree on a fair sentence that included admitting guilt. Otherwise, he would determine a punishment.
I've got the fair sentence in my mind, and it involves going to jail. All rise.
Back in court today, only 2 decided to take the plea, which included home confinement or weekends behind bars. The judge admonished the rest.
All I want from any of these people is just to take some responsibility. But they refuse. They refuse. And
today's sentencing also included community service and thousands of dollars in fines. While some criticized its severity, others said this cheating scandal shortchanged some of the city's most vulnerable children who are now years behind in their education. Lester?
Quite a scene in that courtroom. Rahema, thanks for...
We now have 2 key terms here, and one's called norm reference test. Norm reference tests allow teachers to compare their students with the norms or results obtained from the performance of a sample group or other students. So norm reference, just so you understand, normal curve. Norm reference is when you give a test to a student so that you can compare their results with everyone else. Sometimes you'll hear the results as 95th percentile, 10th percentile, 11th percentile. What that means is if someone scores in the 40th percentile, then there's 40% of people nationwide, or whatever the population is, below you. So for example, if you're Shaquille O'Neal and you're in the 99th percentile of height, then 99% of people in your age or in your area are below your height. That's how the percentile ranks. Those are norm reference tests. The next term is standardized test. Standardized tests are really norm reference tests or other criterion reference tests, and their job is to be standardized so it's all equal. they have specific instructions for administration. So a standardized test, the term for that means that there is a standard way to administer it. Some schools have gone a little crazy with their standardized testing. For example, they don't allow anyone to come visit because they don't want to break the protocol. They have to have 2 people in a room with the test. It's very extreme because standardized tests today, or they used to be until 2016, whenever No Child Left Behind was pretty much repealed, are linked to money. So that's how that works. The next video is going to be a little bit longer, but it's a TED Talk, and it does a really good job. It's called High Stakes Testing and the Demise of Education. The guy does a really good job on how high stakes testing has kind of affected education. So really enjoy this one if you can.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I also want to thank Nick for the introduction and pointing out that I've been teaching for a long time. In fact, about 40 years. And throughout that whole time, I've been working both locally and across the state and across the nation and other countries to improve our public schools and others also private schools. And yet, I think I might say a few things that are a little bit contentious. If I was the kind of person that got discouraged, I would be getting discouraged now about the state of our education system, because I'm very concerned about our obsession with standardized tests and standardized test scores. And I run into teachers every day, just yesterday afternoon in my office, who's saying, now we're getting scripted lessons, and they might as well hire a robot to teach my class. And so people are not going into the profession to the degree they were before, and a lot of people are thinking of diving out of the profession. And so I'm very concerned about that, particularly because people think that the test scores are objective. And what I want to do is argue that, in fact, the test scores are misleading and erroneous, and they should not be believed. And in fact, I would say, it would be great if I could tell you, don't believe anything the state I shouldn't say that. Don't believe anything the state education department tells you. Well, maybe some things. But we should not be elated when test scores go up or dismayed when they go down, because we really have no idea what they mean. So let me give you just a few examples. I could go on for days, but I won't. But many of you know, if you're from New York, you may know that in 1990s, New York State, actually that's not the example I wanted to give you first. The example I want to give you first is we just had the Common Core state exams based on the Common Core state standards that were in the spring. And one of the things that happened is the exams were based on the Common Core curriculum, but unfortunately most schools did not have the curriculum. And it also makes the assumption that, like on math, if you're taking the Math 8 test in the Common Core, that you had taken the previous 7 years, which of course you couldn't. And so in New York State, 31% of the students who took the exam passed or were proficient. In some urban schools, like the Rochester City School District, only 5% of the students passed the exam. So this might sound like a very bad thing. So I was curious what to make of this. And so I looked to see what Commissioner King, he's the Commissioner of Education, said, and in response to these test scores. And he said 31% chance, 30% passing was a good thing. Now, it doesn't sound good, but he said it's a good thing. And then he said, well, it provides us with a baseline. Now, if you're familiar with New York State, we've been giving standardized tests, well, for decades and decades. And we've been using them to assess students and determine whether they graduate, et cetera, for several decades. And, you know, so it's like, what, can't we use those tests for a baseline? Why is this test that comes now a baseline? Secondly, it seemed to me that if only 30% of the students are passing the test, and this is after 20 years of school reform in New York State, focusing on standards and tests, isn't this really an indictment of this last 20 years of school reform in New York State? And should we be doing something different that engages students and in their community, is more interdisciplinary, et cetera? So I have questions for Commissioner King. I also have questions for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City. So over the last 20 years, Mayor Bloomberg, well, he hasn't been mayor for 20 years, it feels like it, but he's run on re-election. It's mayoral control of schools in New York City. So he runs the schools, he appoints the board members, he can get rid of them on a whim, and he's taken credit over the years for any increase in test scores, and that says, well, I should be re-elected. Look, my policies are working, re-elect me. So I was curious. So what does he say about, in New York City, they didn't have a 31% passing rate, they had 26% on literacy and 30% on math. So what's his response to those scores? And he says, it's wonderful news. Now, how is 26% passing wonderful news? This seems to me like the ultimate spin. So when the test scores go up, the mayor says, my policies are working. When the test scores go down, he says, this is wonderful news. It makes me wonder what world we live in, and is he looking at the same figures I am? So let me talk about why we should question the scores and give you some examples, which is the example I was going to give you a minute ago, is some of you who are in New York State may know that in the 1990s, we started requiring that students pass 5 Regents exams in order to graduate from high school. And one of those exams had to be in science. And so the exam most students took was the living environments exam. And Commissioner Mills, I'm going to pick on all the commissioners before I'm done. No. So Commissioner Mills thought he wanted to set the cut score. Now, like when I was a kid, 65 was passing, and that meant you had to get 65% of the questions right. But in fact, it isn't the way the scoring works for the tests in New York State. And so they changed the cut score up and down, and they made it so you only had to get 39% of the questions right to pass the exam. And this was good news for the commissioner, because then he would get, students would pass, students would graduate, and he wouldn't have a large dropout rate, and nobody would blame the commissioner for having a large dropout rate. So that worked, except that people said, this is really misleading, because in fact, they're making the test so easy. It's so easy to pass. And so then the physics exam, he said, well, I'm going to take the physics exam, and I'm going to make that hard. And so what he did is he got 8 people together, and he said, set the cut score really high so we get a high failure rate. This is all in the New York Times, so I can find evidence for this. So but they didn't set it high enough and so he threw them out of the room and got 4 people back, and he said, set the cut score high so we have a high failure rate. And they didn't set it high enough, so then he got 1 person in the room and said, set the cut score high so we have a high failure rate. And that person did. And in fact, that year we had 39% of students taking the physics exam failed. Now, it didn't bother him, and he thought, well, nobody would mind because they didn't need it to graduate from high school, but these were students who were taking physics in order to go on to university. And so they said, it's not really a good thing when you're applying to an Ivy League school, say, and that you got a 70 on the physics exam or that you failed. And in fact, students had lower results on the state exam than on the advanced placement exam. So they criticized the commissioner, and he said, no, this is objective. But there was enough people protesting that finally he reneged and changed the score, and all of a sudden students passed. I find this just remarkable. So, well, what happened then, the same thing happens in the primary grades. So we have an annual test around math and literacy, and for years the scores have been going up. And Mayor Bloomberg is pleased with it. But when I talk to the superintendents, they say, we didn't do anything different, and our scores keep on getting better. We're not getting better kids. So how do we explain this? Well, the way you explained it is, in fact, the state keeps on increasing, lowering the cut score, making more students do well, and everybody looks good. Finally, Chancellor Meryl Tisch, and this was just last year, said that the scores are ridiculously inflated and nobody should believe them. So I told you earlier, you shouldn't believe the scores. The Chancellor says don't believe the scores. And what she did is she rescaled them down and cut them by about a third. And all of us, kids go to bed at night saying, I passed the test. And then they get up in the morning and find out they failed the test because the commissioner changed the whole scoring system. So I don't know about you, but this strikes me as insane, just to be blunt. And so what I'm concerned about is what effect this has on our schools. I'm running out of time. So, you know, what we just had, I need to talk about Governor Cuomo just for a minute, because we had these poor test results, 5% passing in Rochester, and Governor Cuomo says they're going to have to suffer the death penalty. I love the way we talk about schools. They're going to suffer the death penalty. What does that mean? Well, he's going to close the school. He's going to close the school boards and let New York State Education Department run the schools. Now, I know enough about Albany not to think that Albany could run schools any better than we can locally. But that's his plan. And in fact, Commissioner, not forgetting the current commissioner's name, but said he's pushing a bill through the legislature to get that to happen. And the chancellor is working with him on that. But the chancellor and the commissioner both promised that next year the test results will be better. Now, how can they promise the test results will be better? They can change the cut score. So I will bet you 100 to 1 next year the test results will be better because they're going to jigger them to be whatever they want. Last 10 seconds. There are really great things going on in education. I've worked with the Performance Consortium schools here in Rochester, also in New York City. We have great models of what to do. They don't give standardized tests. In Finland, the country that scores the highest on international comparisons, we know they only give a test when the students graduate, like our college boards or SAT, and they give a sample of the test to students over time just to see how the country's doing over time, but nobody gets an individual score. It has no implications for schools or teachers or students. We are a test-mad country, and I'm over time. And I just heard today there was a meeting with Commissioner King, the names came back with the PTA, and they're raising questions, and the commissioner said, I will no longer meet with PTAs about standardized testing. And that just came out this morning. So my last statement is, we need good schools. I need people to look at what's going on, to realize that the test scores aren't objective, and they're being misused and harming students and teachers and families, and thank you very much.
So throughout our education system, standards have been written and assessed by individual school systems and states. So generally we have local and state standards. Recently there's been a push towards a national standards. It's kind of always been there, the need for it. It's really emerged with this idea of Common Core, and y'all all have endured this. But we're not going to go into Common Core. But the idea is there's been a push towards national standards. Teachers, administrators, policymakers, and researchers have worked to develop national up-to-date standards. With Common Core, you saw a large amount of money come in to play for Common Core mathematics standards. And then it also came with science. But Common Core did not and was not funded for the other fields such as social studies and foreign language and English and all those areas. So national organizations have started pushing for national standards. I can speak for social studies. Social studies, about 2 years ago, the National Council for Social Studies started passing these papers that we call them the white pages, these white papers that discussed and argued for a national curriculum, which they called the C3 model. So everybody's like, okay, C3 model, it's going to be good to be in national standards. Well, then for the national conference, which a lot of people attend, they started asking for call for papers which revolved around the C3 model. So they kind of start saying, if you want to go to this national conference, we're really going to be pushing and advocating for a national C3 common, almost like a Common Core curriculum. Why did they do this? Some would argue, and many would be right, that the National Council for Social Studies was pushing for national standards that they themselves controlled, and that's why they kind of got out ahead of it and created the C3 model. They did not want someone else to create a national standards for them. Another attempt would be they saw that there was major funding in the Common Core for the other subjects, and maybe that by creating national standards they could receive money as well. The C3 model is there, it's good, it's kind of going away because people are like, well, why did we create it? And it's just not really there to an extreme. But the movement towards national standards has always been there, and we've never seen it more clearer than the Common Core movement. In 2006, the federal government reauthorized the Secondary Education Act, and in that they actually put a provision that said no federal grant can be tied exclusively to the Common Core, effectively killing Common Core. So no major money can be tied to that. So national standards are kind of going away at this time, but they're always going to be there. This is a pretty good video, this next piece called What Should Replace Common Core? So I'm going to show that video this time.
No Child Left Behind, the country's most sweeping education law, has long been blamed for a rise in standardized testing and for unfairly labeling schools as failing. This week, the Senate took up the first bipartisan effort to replace the law since it expired 8 years ago. It would remove much of the federal footprint from education. Hari Srinivasan has the details.
Instead of federal rules for grading and punishing schools, the Senate legislation would let states design their own accountability systems. But serious disagreements remain. The White House is calling for rules that tell states when to intervene in low-performing schools. And some Republicans want federal funds for low-income students to follow them to the school of their choice. Here to look at what this could mean for schools are Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies for the American Enterprise Institute, and Bob Wise, former governor of West Virginia and president of the Alliance for Excellent Education. So, Rick, I want to start with you first. All schools were supposed to be at this place where kids were learning at grade level by last year. We didn't get there. How does this piece of legislation think it can fix that?
Turns out that when you pass a law like No Child Left Behind back in 2001 that says 100% of children will be proficient in reading and math by 2014, the fact that Congress would like it to be so doesn't make it so. And I think that's the big lesson here. No Child Left Behind really did two things around accountability. One is it created made an enormous contribution, because for the first time we had real comparable data on every child in every state on how they were doing in reading and math grades 3 to 8, again in high school, and science at elementary, middle, and high school. What No Child Left Behind got wrong was in their desire to make a difference. Congress wrote this convoluted, problematic, overreaching accountability system, which tried to tell states how to decide which schools were doing well or not and how to intervene in those schools. Turns out Congress is actually horribly configured to do this, and what you wound up creating was a lot of test mania, a lot of compliance, and very little that actually contributed in any way to helping kids get better. What I think you see in the laws, in the proposals right now that just passed the House and that's getting debated in the Senate, is an effort to keep the part of No Child Left Behind that worked well, this transparency, this regular assessment, but to get the federal government out of that micromanagement business.
So, Bob Wise, you've been a governor before. Will replacing federal guidelines with state guidelines fix the problem, especially for those parents out there who were seriously complaining about testing and the culture that it's created?
So what we have, I think, is a legislative Goldilocks right now. Rick is absolutely right. I agree with him that the early No Child Left Behind was too prescriptive, too hot. But at the same token, the House version particularly removes any kind of meaningful accountability. And so what you need is you need the ability to report on students that are having low outcomes, measure them over a period of time, and then for the federal government to say to states, look, you've got to do something. We're not telling you what. That's what they tried to do in No Child Left Behind. We're not telling you what, but we are saying that you do need to act, and there is a federal role in helping support that. So that's where I think that we still have to get it right in terms of where the Senate bill is.
Rick, if the federal government says that you can create your own measurements of success and failure, do we basically go to a pre-No Child Left Behind era where we have 50 sets of measurement from different states?
Well, basically, No Child Left Behind, we've actually had 50 sets of measurements from 50 states because each state gets to choose its standards and its tests. So what you have are data that are comparable for every child in a state, but not necessarily across states. That doesn't change under the laws being debated. What you really go back to, I described it as the long way home. What you go back to is what Bill Clinton actually proposed in 1994, which was he said, look, let's have every state test every child once in elementary school in reading and math, once in middle school, once in high school, and let's make sure that data is out there so that parents and policymakers and educators and voters can make informed decisions. What we're going to wind up with under, say, a House bill is what Clinton proposed in '94 on steroids. You actually have tests every grade level from 3 to 8 in reading and math, again in high school, and then the science, elementary, middle, and high school. What it does is, unlike pre-NCLB, it makes sure that folks can't hide problems. You're going to break out data for all these different subgroups by economic status and by ethnicity. And what you're going to have, what's going to be different from under No Child Left Behind, is the federal government will not be in the business of deciding which schools need to be intervened in and how you're supposed to intervene in them.
So, Bob Wise, one of the points of contention between the House and the Senate bills is this idea that the dollars should follow low-income kids if they choose to leave a low-performing school and go either to a better-performing school, which I guess is the goal. But how much money are we talking about? How significant is this? And what's the impact of the states?
Well, the impact of the states can be great, and I think it's significant. We're talking roughly $14 to $15 billion in Title I, and those are the dollars that go to concentrations of low-income children. But I think it's significant to note that the Senate rejected that approach, even when offered by the Republican chairman. In the House, I don't believe either they didn't take it up or they rejected it as well. But I think that what Rick talks about is important to note. Yes, there's going to be more flexibility, regardless of what version passes. But I'm concerned that I don't want to see the Bill Clinton 1994 approach he says on steroids. I don't want to see it run amok. If you've got 1,200 high schools that are graduating or where more than 1/3 of their kids drop out, I think it's fair for the federal government to say, why do we have these high dropout rates? We're not telling you how to fix it, but after this has happened for several years, what are you going to do to fix it, and what are the tools you need to fix it? That, I think, is the key debate that's still taking place, particularly on the Senate side.
So, Rick, is this legislation essentially reflecting this kind of popular uprising against the Common Core?
No, I think it's more accurate to say the Common Core got caught up in the frustration with No Child Left Behind. I think you've got parents who feel like their children are being overtested. It's not so much the federally mandated tests under No Child Left Behind. It's more all of the urgency put behind getting kids to make sure they're proficient on those tests, which has led school districts to do lots of formative assessment to make sure kids are ready for the tests, lots of test preparation. The idea is by keeping the transparency, but by loosening that terror of being on the federal government black hat list, that what's going to happen is school districts will be able to be more sensible and measured about these tests. And I think what's going to happen is on debates around testing, around evaluation of teachers, around standards and Common Core, you would actually see a lessening of some of the temperature because people are going to feel that the stakes have been reduced to a more moderate range.
Bob Wise, quick last word.
Rick, I think, has summed up well a lot of the situation. I just want to add that let's also remember that it was the states that, whether they adopted the Common Core or they adopted their own college and career-ready standards, every state has now moved to a college and career-ready standard. We want to make sure that the federal government is supporting that state initiative.
All right, Bob Wise, Rick Hess, thanks so much for joining us.
So this lecture has kind of taken a path of what are grades, what's an assessment system, what are standards, and then we looked at national standards and how the government's kind of gotten wild with that. And now we're getting back to the assessment system, which is the most important assessment system, and that is the one within the classroom setting. Teacher-made tests and teacher-made assessment systems are critical to our education system. There are many articles and there's many textbooks on how a person should write, for example, multiple choice, essays, teacher checklist, rubrics, teacher observations, and items such as that. When someone's student teaching or when someone's beginning the alternate route program, we have to really teach them the basic concept of assessments. But usually when they get to the graduate level, they go, okay, I understand assessment systems. But so what we want to do is we want to say, you're a teacher. We're not really going to have to spend time on teaching you how to make a test. But can you, as a department head or as a future principal or anybody who wants to be a higher level educator, can you effectively incorporate an assessment system that you desire into a school system and train people on that. So assessment systems are critical, and having a system, I know I'm talking very abstract, so let's get more specific. So if you're, for example, teaching a 10th grade history class, can you have an assessment system which will be easy for the students to understand, but also convey and collect the data that you need to give the parents an overall impression? If you're a school administrator, can you create an assessment system for all the 9th through 12th history courses, which can track students as they progress through those grades? And for example, if I have a 9th grade history class that's doing a very good job, and in 10th grade, Billy and everyone's grades drop, and in 11th grade their grades increase, then I would need to look at the assessment system that is in 10th grade, because maybe that system is not giving a good reflection. It's not collecting the data I need. And then on a larger scale, if you ultimately end up in the central office and you're coordinator of assessments, can you create assessment systems for a school-based system that also will allow data collection and easy training of the teachers? So assessment systems are very important. Today, some of the underperforming schools, they have an assessment system, but they rely heavily on the state test and the standardized testing system, which now you know that term as well. So when standardized testing come in, they know that that's very important. I can usually find a weaker school whenever a teacher says, everything depends on the state test. Everything depends on the standardized testing system. I can always find a really strong school when a principal will tell us, we do data collection. And I'll say, are you worried about the state test coming up? And they'll say, no, we use the state test as just part of our assessment system. And that's when it's like, oh, okay, I like that. That's when you start feeling it's better. This idea that the standardized test is the gatekeeper, the key thing, is really a crutch for a poor assessment system. So this, I have two little things. I'm just going to show you one video at this time because I don't want to go too long on a YouTube video because it gets crazy. And that is the South Korean model. So let me just give you a brief description of the South Korean model. The South Korean has the best education system. They produce very high-level, competent, educated adults. But they also use the standardized test as a critical benchmark for their students. So critical that if a student does poorly on a standardized test, then that can actually hurt their career choices and their career path. When I say path, I want you to think of train tracks. The South Korean model uses tracks. So if you're doing a good job in education and you're scoring very high on your standardized test every year, then you stay on a track of your curriculum that is going to determine your future, a very good one. You may become a medical doctor. If you do poorly on some of your standardized tests, then your track may shift over and you may not have a high-paying job. Also, South Koreans are very quick to point out that their culture and their society is based on companies that do a lot of thinking. They do a lot of technology. So really the only way to excel themselves as someone who does a really good job and make a lot of money is to do it academically. So that's why test scores are so high for them. They also have the highest suicide rate in the modern world for teenagers because of the stress. So this video is just about the South Korean model, and I hope you enjoy it.
South Korea, where a child's life revolves around education. Regular school is followed in the evening by private school, a double shift of schooling, making them some of the most formidable pupils in the world. 16-year-old Haimin goes to school in Gangnam in Seoul, made famous by the pop star Psy. After school, she leaves with her brother. But far from relaxing at home, she sets off again for her second round of study. Even the little ones do a double shift. Long after what might be considered bedtime in the UK, these tots are still working.
72가지인데 여기가 이제 경우수가 72가지인데
Haimin then spends hours here at the Hagwon or private crammer, just like the great majority of Korean children.
I get tired easily, but I can forget about my hardships when I see my results because they're kind of good.
Hyman gets home after 11, having spent a mammoth 13 hours in study. It's bed at 2 a.m. and then up again at 6:30 to do it all over again.
Korea has few natural resources. We only have people. So anyone who wants to be successful really has to stand out. As a mother, I don't feel comfortable about this, but it's the only thing she can do to achieve her dream.
The result of this non-stop study is children who are fantastic at tests. We set these 15 and 16-year-olds some GCSE maths questions. They did them in half the expected time, with most of them getting full marks.
I like going to school because there are many good friends and good teachers.
Sometimes I'm very tired, like exhausted, but I don't mind because I'm studying now to do what I want to do in future.
For the economy, this huge investment in education has taken the country in just 2 generations from mass illiteracy to technological powerhouse. Korean brands are internationally famous. The country's built itself up with extraordinary single-mindedness since the end of the war with North Korea 60 years ago.
But Korea's success has come at a cost. The pressure on young people is huge, and the suicide rate is the highest of all developed countries. Is this pressurized environment really sustainable?
I don't think any other country has achieved such rapid growth as South Korea in the past 50 years. We focused on school achievement, and that's put a lot of people under stress, hence the high suicide rates. We still have a long way to go, but we're doing some soul searching and we're trying to make our people happier.
In many ways, Korea is the envy of the Western world. Ministers in Westminster and beyond look longingly at its education record and are remodelling their own systems to try to compete. But Korea's phenomenal success has come at a real price for its people, a price the country is now gradually starting to weigh up. Rita Chakrabarti, BBC News, Seoul.
So this kind of wraps up our lecture. The goal of this lecture was to teach you about assessment systems and kind of a larger big picture system. And as more advanced students, you'll see that when you use these terminologies like grades, evaluations, norm referenced, standardized testing, assessment systems, and you'll see that if you use these interchangeable in your career, then whenever you get a higher up position in education, you can start saying we need to have an assessment system. We need to have an authentic assessment system. Hopefully also this lecture has allowed you some avenues that you can go down. And I don't want to spend 6 hours or 8 hours on just the Atlanta cheating scandal, but if you ever get some time, you can spend a couple of hours, you can spend a couple of days looking at the South Korean education system and looking at their assessment system and see how that works. You can also look at the Atlanta cheating scandal. You can look at the Mississippi smaller cheating scandal. They also have one in Massachusetts. And you can see how high-stake standardized systems connected to national curriculum caused stress and caused people to do some crazy stuff. You can also look at teaching strategies and how teachers can make individual test items in their assessment system. If you ask me, I believe where the future lies in assessments is I believe over the next 5 to 10 years that we're going to see a movement towards assessment systems that are definitely in-housed in schools, and the better schools, the top-notch schools, will start creating assessment systems where they're going to use some of these standardized tests as items in their assessment system. And because for the next 5 or 10 years, the idea of standardized testing is going to be kind of a negative sense for teachers. They're going to say, I didn't like that, that wasn't a good idea. So a better principal, a better administrator will start saying, well, we already have all of this testing systems. We have all of these assessment systems. Let's just create our own that's going to go from grade to grade, and let's have it where it's friendlier and more teacher impact and teacher input. So assessments are kind of fun to do. And I just want you to start thinking like the big picture on that. And I hope you enjoyed the lecture.